Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2u.net/sociology. And there you can pick up revision guides, revision videos, flashcards, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so on to this episode. And my guests for this episode are Kate Stewart and Matthew Cole. Thank you very much for joining me.
Hi.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Thank you. Do you want to start by introducing yourself? Tell us who you are, what you do.
Sure. My name is Kate Stewart and I'm Principal Lecturer in Sociology at Nottingham Trent University.
Hi, and I'm Matthew and I'm a lecturer in criminology at the Open University, although my background is in sociology.
Great. And you just mentioned background. I'm always interested to see where the sociology journey started for people. So when did you first encounter the subject?
Wow. So 1984 for me, I did, which is when I started my A-levels. I took sociology A-level. I can't remember what inspired me to, because I'd not studied it previously. But that was when I first encountered the big blue A-level book that is still...
Harold Ambos.
Yeah, I think second edition maybe it was in 1984. And then I studied sociology and social policy as my undergraduate degree at Cardiff University, went on and did research methods masters there and my PhD there. And actually it was kind of medical sociology really was where I started, and then started working at the medical school at Cardiff University after I finished my PhD, where I was working in the dental school, in the dental public health unit, and got into an interest around food with my research with colleagues there. And it was at that point then when I first met Matthew, and it kind of came together eventually in terms of our work around food and veganism and children's perceptions of food and practices around food as well. So until I started working at Nottingham Trent 5 years ago, I had always spent my career in medical schools. Before that, I was at Cardiff, I was at Bristol, then I was at Nottingham Medical School for a while. So this is my first social sciences department after all of these years, which has been quite interesting. But that's how the journey's gone from medical sociology to sociology of veganism, which to some people may sound like an odd journey, but it makes absolute and perfect sense.
Yeah. And what about yourself, Matthew? How was your journey?
Well, I'm a latecomer compared to Kate, definitely. My first encounter with sociology was 1993. When I began my A-levels, I was a mature student. I use the word mature very loosely, but I was at the time. And I started my A-level on a recommendation of a friend as a part-time course. I knew nothing about it, and I was overwhelmed with how amazing it was, really from the first lesson. And, the wonderful blue book that we've already mentioned was very important. And
which edition was it?
I've no idea. Later than your one. So yeah, I just fell in love with the discipline. It helped make sense of the world in ways that really spoke to me, because I'd had this vague sense of unease that I wasn't happy with the way society was organised in all kinds of ways, and sociology made sense of that. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. I just want to keep going. And so I did. I went on to do my degree at Bristol in sociology and then a master's at Goldsmiths. And then I went back to Bristol for my PhD in sociology. And I had a real interest in the sociology of unemployment at the time during my PhD, which was related to my own personal experiences. I'd been unemployed for quite a long time during the late 80s and early 90s before my A-level. And by the time I finished that, my interest in that had been exhausted, I suppose. It was quite a cathartic experience writing about unemployment with that personal angle on it. And then I wanted to do something different. And that coincided with me going vegan around the time I finished my PhD. And a friend of mine said, well, why don't you explore the sociological angle or angles around veganism? So I thought, well, that's a really good idea. So I did that, and that's how I met Kate, giving a conference paper, the first one I did on veganism. We met at Boston University in the States, where Kate was giving a paper of her own, and
at exactly the same time.
At exactly the same time.
We didn't go. I was giving a paper on children's food practices and how they process information, how they understand information about food that they get. And Matthew was doing his paper on veganism, but we were doing our papers at exactly the same time. So we actually had no idea whether academically we were terribly interesting from that point of view, other than those conference chats you have when you meet people.
Yeah, so we kind of had to represent our papers to each other after we'd delivered them to an audience of academics. And then, we found we had shared interests, definitely, and began working together when Kate, as she said, she was working at Cardiff, and I got a job there as well after I left Bristol. And we started working together on ideas around veganism, around childhood socialisation in particular, how children are brought up to think about other animals, relate to them, or equally as important, not think about them or not think about them in particular ways, especially the ways we as a society exploit them. And we just carried on from there. Meanwhile, I was worked at Bristol, worked at Cardiff, worked at Derby University for a little bit. And I started at the Open University in 2009 as a tutor, what the OU calls associate lecturers. And that gradually became more and more of my main employment until a couple of years ago, it became all of my employment when I became a lecturer in sociology initially at the OU. And then I switched to the criminology department just over a year ago. But still very much working from a sociological perspective, looking at how social harms against animals are generated. So that's me.
Great. And it's quite a niche area, isn't it? Sociology of food, or veganism in particular.
Yeah.
Well, kind of. But then also, that now obviously, or maybe not obviously, veganism's a much kind of broader church than just our food practices, but our food practices are one of the most conspicuous and obvious elements, I suppose, that relates to veganism. And that's something we do 3 times a day. So whilst on the one hand, yes, it's niche, it's one of those kind of hidden in plain sight things, because it is about how we come to accept the individual and social and group practices around eating and the ethics and the politics of all of that. And whilst the practice of veganism might feel as if it's, unusual, niche, that actually it's set within something that is happening all around us all the time for all of us.
Yeah, I spoke recently to Dr. Letitia Brown, who also does something on the sociology of food, and she was remarking that it should be a much bigger researched area, actually, because it affects all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that some of the other things, in terms of looking specifically at veganism, I think, food is and issues around animals and animal rights. They're those areas that have been on the edges, I think, of sociology, because, in order to make the discipline distinct from other sciences, that other disciplines that emerged around the same time in terms of how we understand discipline boundaries, those were things that other disciplines were looking at, food and nutrition and issues to do with non-human life were the domain of other disciplines, not sociology. So it's there's been a bit of kind of sidelining, I suppose, because of that, because we've not traditionally thought of sociology perhaps of dealing with those issues. But we're sociologists, and we do those things. We eat multiple times a day, so it should much more be.
Yeah, and I think when I was talking very briefly about my sort of career path, I suppose, it certainly felt like being in a niche during most of those years until, well, really the last year and a bit for me, because this is the first time I've been able to work on these issues that I'm most passionate about within my kind of formal job role. And prior to that, our research it was almost like a hobby, wasn't it? I mean, we were doing it in our own time. It wasn't really part of our paid jobs, because it has been quite a marginal area of concern for sociology as a discipline as a whole. And I think that's partly to do with the roots of sociology itself being very much focused on human experience.
Yes.
And that means there's this great sort of blank spot, well, not really a spot, these huge vistas, these huge areas of social interaction with other animals, involving other animals, based on the exploitation of other animals and so on, that sociology hasn't been great at paying attention to until quite recently, in quite recent years. But now it's really exploding, and we feel like, oh yeah, we can do this, and we can make this the centre of our careers in ways that wasn't possible before. So it's definitely a very exciting time, and it feels like things are changing in really positive ways.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you that as a starting point, actually, because obviously it is exploding. The movement is exploding and bigger than ever. Were you kind of early adopters to it?
Well, I wouldn't say an early adopter. I mean, personally, I went vegan in 2005.
Yeah.
And but one of my biggest regrets is I didn't do it sooner. I went vegetarian in 1993. I think I went vegetarian. So it took me 12 years to take that next step to veganism. And I think a lot of that is to do with the social context that I was in at the time, being sort of not connected with other vegans or even vegetarians really for many years, and not being as well educated about the issues that were involved in veganism as I became later on. So I certainly don't feel like an early adopter, but it's all relative, isn't it? That's just my own biographical story.
Yeah. I think for both of us, so I went vegan a couple of years after Matthew had, so that would be probably 2007, I guess, I went vegan. And kind of the other way around, when Matthew was talking about how his academic interest came from his sort of biographical experience of going vegan, it was almost the other way around. It was the tipping point for me, my kind of growing academic and sociological interest in that area, which was just, it became an irresistible case for me to go, well, what am I doing? Why am I still behaving like this in relation to my practices of consumption of other animals? The easiest thing to do here is to go vegan. So it's interesting that the sort of tipping point, or the balancing of those scales between the academic interest and the personal biographical connection to veganism are slightly the opposite way around for myself and for Matthew. But but similarly, that when people ask me how long I've been vegan, and I say 13 years, nearly 14 years now, that sounds like a long time to a lot of people. But like Matthew, I wouldn't call myself an early adopter of it. It took me quite a long time to get there.
Thank you. And so should we start to talk about your research into the area as well? Do you want to tell us a little bit about your research into veganism?
Yeah, so it kind of started when we were both still at Cardiff, and there was like a film club, an animal rights film club, that just kind of a small group of interested social scientists. And one of the weeks we watched Charlotte's Web, and it just kind of sparked off the thinking about children's stories, really just sparked off a thinking chain of events, which then kind of all came together around the idea of fast food tie-in meals, and how absolutely wild it is when you kind of stop and think about it. This idea that you can go and see an animated movie where you are aimed at children, and the children are invited to root for the main character, who is likely to be a non-human animal, and then after the movie's over, you nip across the car park to the fast food restaurant and pick yourself up a meal which has bits of dead animal in it and a little toy representation of the animal that you have been invited to care about. And this became an object of real interest to us. And that was the first piece of work that we looked at, was this relationship between children's films and tie-in products, and how they channel empathy and caring to representations of certain kinds of animals and away from the actual body, the dead bits of animal that children are being introduced to at that age. We started with that as the focus of our interest, but then as we got into that, we saw the same things over and over again in a whole range of areas of childhood socialisation. So then we went on and we wrote our book, Our Children and Other Animals, which came out in 2014, which looked at a whole range, how these similar sorts of processes can be seen in education, in children's, not only children's food, but in entertainment, in clothing, what am I missing, mass media, games, toys, all sorts of areas. So we broadened it out to look at that.
Yeah, and rewinding slightly from that, when we met and started working on these things together, my initial interest in veganism was related to my PhD research, and especially using the theory of Michel Foucault and looking at the way that discourses are so important in framing the way we think about and discuss issues, and indeed how we conceive of issues that are important or worthy of our attention or not. So I was especially interested in how language and indeed culture kind of marginalises other animals and marginalises veganism itself. And also I was interested in making connections with utopianism, with utopian studies and veganism, which was related to some teaching I was doing at Bristol University. So I put those interests together and came up with the word vegatopia, the neologism, putting together veganism and utopia, because I wanted to kind of build an argument that veganism was utopian in the sense that it was challenging the dominant social order, which was to exploit other animals, but at the same time make us ignore the fact that that was going on, which is exactly the kind of stuff Kate's talking about with Charlotte's Web and all of our interests that flowed from that. So there is this kind of overriding interest, I think, in how the dominant social order is based on using other animals in harmful, exploitative ways, and at the same time convincing us that either it's all fine, or that we shouldn't even think about it, or that we're actually still really great people because we love animals. At the same time, all this stuff is going on. Yeah. So it does lead us into these very peculiar kind of cultural artifacts, the kind of things that Kate was talking about, where you have this, bizarre juxtaposition of a dead animal alongside a toy animal in a box being given to children. And the more we thought about it, the more, still now, I still can't really believe that actually happens. So there are these connections between social theory and cultural practices and pop culture. It's all interlinked.
Thank you. That's really, really fascinating. That's going to be the end of part one. In part two, we're going to carry on the discussion about veganism.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Hello, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Kate Stewart and Matthew Cole about their research on veganism. In part one, we were just you were just talking about the impact on children in particular. I wondered how aware children actually were of what they're seeing and what they're digesting and what they're taking on through the media.
What children see, I think that children do have that moment when they work out, as children do with all the uncomfortable truths of the human life experience, when children work out that food on their plate is connected to a living animal, that there are moments where they confront that, and how that is dealt with very often as some of the things that Matthew was talking about just earlier, that's kind of pushed aside or explained away, or this is a different kind of, no, these are the ones we eat, and this is that embracing of that sort of natural, obvious connection of, hang on a minute, this is a dead animal, is not capitalized on usually. That we find ways of explaining away, sliding over, confronting that uncomfortable truth. And we do that with all kinds of things that children work out in those early years, be that about sex, be that about death, those moments where they go, hang on a minute, what's the deal with this? We have ways with younger children of getting over that. Wrapping around all of that are a set of practices that make all of those practices in terms of how we consume animals normal and not noteworthy anymore. And what we looked at in Our Children and Other Animals, right from infancy, from, when you look at the imagery of baby food, baby formula, meals, clothing, toys, all of these things that are introduced and surround children from the very beginning of their lives start to frame animals as being there for certain purposes and different animals being there for different purposes, and food and normal meals consisting of certain things. So, for example, we looked at baby food jars was one of the things that we look at in the book. And, the contents of baby food jars pretty much is rice and vegetable, whatever it says on the label, with some additional flavourings. But if you look at the pictures that go with them and the names on the jars of what this meal is, they very much then reinforce this idea of a roast dinner, a shepherd's pie, a fish pie. They're called all of these things, not just, here's a jar of mashed up rice and vegetables, so that they're reinforcing this idea of what is normal and usual. And that process starts, as I say, in infancy. It starts straight away. So I think that, yes, children do recognise these things, but the weight of all the stuff that wraps around our childhood socialisation that leads us to those normative practices around what we consume overwhelms, in very many cases, overwhelms that recognition that children have.
Yeah, and I think in these kind of examples, it becomes really clear how practices and representations are interrelated as well. So as Kate was talking about, we looked at a lot of things like food packaging and children's clothing and how animals are represented in these areas, but also the practices of what do we feed children? What do we give very young infants to eat? And the foods that we're given to eat, of course, we don't have much of a choice in that. We eat what we're given, at least up to a certain point, before we can start expressing preferences in ways that are more or less persuasive, depending on our context. But that very early socialization process means that these practices are embedded before we can vocalize them, before we can reflect on them, and before we can challenge them. So it's actually quite difficult. And I think we should be extremely impressed by children's capacities to break through that very intense socialization processes, those processes when children do recognize, the food on the plate, that kind of the face on the plate, as the phrase goes, and start challenging this and saying, hang on.
Yeah, because not only is it the difficulty of, those familiar practices that we become socialised into, but there's those additional layers with our eating practices that they're a really important part of our social networks. They're a really important part of how we frame our identity in terms of our family, our friends, our social practices. So there's almost, if you reject those, you're almost sending a message that you're rejecting part of family life. If you no longer wish to sit down and share the same meal as the people you are close to, it also has that layer of being about a commentary on those bonds, because it's one of the ways in which we make and reinforce those social bonds as well. So it isn't just about that sort of intellectual exercise of working out what's going on. There's that really socially powerful set of connections that you're having to challenge as well. And that's one of the hardest things about changing any food practices. And when it's a food practice that's about ethics, that's really, really hard, because you're kind of saying to your loved ones, I think you're morally wrong on something, and I'm going to break away from you and everything you stand for. So,
yes.
It makes it much harder, much more powerful in terms of the prospect of being able to change. So, like Matthew says, when people do it at a young age, I think that's incredibly impressive in terms of being able to negotiate that. It took us till our 30s
Yes.
to do it.
Yeah, and going back briefly to my own, biographical story about veganism, when I went vegan, I was on my own. I was living alone. I was single. So that made it incredibly easy. There was no difficult processes of negotiating with other people in the household, or, upsetting people who were used to particular ways of eating. I didn't have to do any of that. It was just up to me to kind of, work out the practical stuff, which was pretty simple, about what to cook, how to look after myself, and where to go shopping and those kinds of things, which were, they were just fun adventures for me to go on my own in a way. And then I quickly connected with other vegans and it all became very simple. But it's not that straightforward for a lot of people who are in households that have very different understandings about veganism and concerns about it, and indeed very different ideas about the role of other animals in our societies. So, yeah, context is everything for sure.
Yeah, and we're, at the time of recording, I should, for context, just say we've just turned over a new year and we are in Veganuary. So there's lots of people possibly considering a change of diet. And you just mentioned just how difficult is that, because our socialization is very ingrained within us, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that works on lots of different levels, as Kate's already been speaking about. I mean, there are the practical aspects, which are, I don't want to dismiss them, they are significant. If you're used to eating and indeed consuming animals in all kinds of ways, according to kind of familiar routines and patterns, there is a bit of work involved in changing those sometimes. And that might involve, substituting vegan ingredients into familiar meals initially. That's often a common way that people go, like eating plant-based burgers or sausages or whatnot. And then perhaps developing more kind of creative ways of plant-based cooking that don't involve just substituting, but doing new things, which is fantastic. So there is all of that stuff, which is one aspect, but also there's all the social aspects of making that change. And I think in some ways it might be more difficult, in some ways it might be easier at the moment, because we're in the context of the pandemic. And of course that means a lot of the social aspects of consuming animals, such as eating out, socializing with friends in a restaurant or a pub or wherever, those aren't present, or certainly not in the same ways as they have been. So to the extent that people might be more in control of their social environment, it might make it more straightforward. But on the other hand, of course, a lot of people are going to be in close proximity with others in their household who are maybe not so keen on the idea. So I think if you were going vegan as a household right now, I think maybe there's no easier time quite possibly to do it. But if that's not your situation, there might be different kinds of challenges.
And I think as well, on top of that, in terms of the, we can't even just call it 2020 now, because this pandemic saga is is just as bad as it ever has been at the moment that we're recording this. but it's also, as well as those sort of removal of those usual social practices that perhaps we're not having to engage with in the same way that Matthew was talking about, we're also in a context where everything has changed. So this whole idea of it's not that we've just been taken out of one normal setting, but we're actually doing everything differently. So the prospect of doing this aspect of how you manage your life differently is it's another reason why it's not as big a step at the moment, perhaps because we've had to revise how we do all sorts of things, and this could be just one more thing. So it's really interesting and will be really interesting to see how these patterns of uptake of different practices around animal use have shaken out over the last nearly year, and in an ongoing way, whether that appeal, that comfort of going back to familiar dishes from my childhood, which are more likely not to be vegan dishes, or whether that, well, here's an opportunity to try something, how that all shakes out in terms of whether it does give space for more people to try it at the moment, or whether we all kind of retreat into the familiar in terms of more traditional practices. All fascinating, as sociologists, it's just all really interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, it is about how resilient, flexible, adaptable humans actually are.
Yeah, and I think as a sociology lecturer as well, how it's because everything is different but the same in so many ways, that ability to look critically, to look afresh, to look sociologically at the familiar is just really exciting. And I'm endlessly impressed with students this year and how well they are able to go to those, look at that sociologically and look at that sociologically, just because everything's moved slightly on its axis. So everything around us that perhaps usually takes a little bit more prompting for us to look at in an unfamiliar way, in a sociological way, we're doing that anyway because everything's shifted slightly. So it's a really interesting and exciting time to be looking at, everything sociologically, not just the sorts of things that Matthew and I do, but especially those things, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also I think because of the really difficult situation that we're all in, and that doesn't just relate to the pandemic, of course, we've become ever more sensitized as a society to multiple injustices and inequalities. And I think in that context, something like Veganuary can be quite empowering. It's like, okay, what can we do locked down? What can we do to try and make a positive change in the world? Well, of course, there's still many, many things we can do and do, but this is one of them. Because we know about the harmful environmental impacts, the harmful impacts on other animals, of course, and on human health, human public health of consuming animal products. So, Veganuary gives us ways of thinking, right, I can still make a positive difference in the world, even though I can't go out in it in the ways that I'm used to or would like to. And that's very valuable, I think, for people.
And it's something that we've often said this when we've talked about our work, that it's when you're looking at kind of social justice issues, that here is something that you can do something about immediately. You can do, if it's nearly lunchtime, you can go and do something about it when you have your lunch. That our ability to participate and do something active in terms of a change around a social justice issue is right there. You can start doing something about it immediately. So that opportunity to feel, as Matthew was saying, in control, to feel that you're able to do something is I think really clear around this sort of area.
Because you mentioned right at the start, actually, that, kind of the popularity of veganism has exploded over the last few years. Could you link it to a particular reason? I guess it's multifaceted, but is there a particular reason why you think there's been such an explosion of the popularity in the last few years?
Well, yeah, I think multiplicity of reasons is absolutely it. I think we certainly can't overlook the digital revolution, if we can call it that, the explosion of the the availability of information about animal exploitation. That's certainly a big aspect. So it's never been easier to find out about the harms that we inflict on other animals and to be, you know, repelled by that and want to do something about it. And at the same time, there are all kind of resources available to help us. I mean, again, it's never been easier to learn all the practical stuff and indeed to get all kinds of tips about overcoming the social obstacles and to make new social connections with other vegans. All of that kind of stuff is very important. I think also we're seeing an upsurge in people who are vegan having some kind of wider cultural impact through their professional work, whether that be, well, in academia to some extent. I mean, we're very grateful for us to have this opportunity to speak in this format, of course. But lots of people are working in the media, you know, directly, making documentaries, making fictional media that features vegan themes. There's all that going on as well. And I think also we should always remember the decades of really hard work put in by innumerable people within the vegan movement, plugging away with their campaigning, you know, making the same arguments for, 70, 80 years by now that we're still making. And these are being heard in ways that they haven't been heard before, not on the same level, but they've always been there. So I think, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, definitely, with all the work that we do. And indeed, part of our work is looking into, archival research of the early vegan movement and trying to bring that back into public consciousness or amplify its significance in giving us a direction for what we're trying to do. So that's just a couple of things that I think are important.
Yeah, there's a sort of snowballing, I guess, as well, that it's, as Matthew said, that there's been many decades of people, working very hard in terms of the vegan movement. But that, and whatever, whether it is just a case of after a long time, the stone starts to roll kind of thing.
Yes.
Apologies for mixing the metaphors there. Or that it then starts to pick up some momentum because it's about a social practice. This is why it is so important that we look at this sociologically as well, is that once you start seeing other vegans, meeting other vegans, once the idea of veganism and vegans becomes part of our social worlds, all of those individual barriers to the idea of being one of those start to shift as well. And with that, we start to see the availability of products so that it is easier. It is less of a strange and unusual and alien change to make. And that can kind of continues and that picks up momentum. So it may just be that there is that kind of momentum going now that is speeding all of those things up.
Yeah, I think we're seeing really quite significant shifts in the discourse, I think, going back to my Foucauldian interest, and that role of discourse, as Foucault argued, in silencing being so important. And I think that's just increasingly difficult to pull off that trick. So the powers that be, the animal agriculture industries and that ilk, they're still trying to do all the same stuff, to undermine veganism, to rubbish veganism, to dispute its claims and stuff in ways that are increasingly untenable and are being directly contradicted, challenged, undermined by vegans themselves in all kinds of ways, in academic, intellectual ways, in cultural ways, in subversive ways.
I think a lot of the sort of social stereotypes of what a vegan is and looks like and does and thinks as well, that they're getting harder and harder to sustain. And again, that's one of these things that picks up momentum because, when you know a couple of vegans, increasingly you go, oh, well, actually that stuff about them being grey and miserable and worthy and holier than thou and all of these sorts of things. Which ones am I missing? You
shouldn't reproduce the stereotypes.
Sandal wearing. Well, increasingly we see them as being rubbish because we know people who are vegan and who aren't like that. And the number of times it's happening less and less, but when the first few years I was vegan, when people found out I was a vegan, not because I told them straight away, contrary to the popular joke,
Yes.
but they'd be surprised, and I'd be like, why? Because I'm too fat and jolly and mumsy. And they'd go, oh no, I didn't mean that. But of course, that's exactly what the surprise was, that I didn't look like their idea of what a vegan should look like 10 years ago. So those stereotypes, those social stereotypes that may have previously acted as a barrier, are, like Matthew says, one of the many things that's increasingly untenable, because more and more people know vegans who aren't like those scary stereotypes.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Thank you so much for your input today. It's been really interesting for me to learn quite a bit about veganism as well. So I really, really do appreciate you giving up your time today.
It's been great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
And before we finish, I always ask if you could share a little bit about yourselves. If people want to find out more information or follow you on Twitter, how can they go about doing that?
So I'm the one of this double act who has social media. Matthew avoids it. So I'm on Twitter. You can find me Kate Stew, KATESTEW. Can't spell my name. You can find me there. If you search for me, Kate Stewart at Nottingham Trent University, you'll find my usual profile of stuff. We've written a few pieces for The Conversation as well. If you search our names on The Conversation, you'll see some of the bits of work we've done there. There's all kinds of exciting stuff on the OU website as well, which Matthew can tell you about.
So I'm not personally on social media, but you can find my academic profile if you just search for Matthew Cole Open University. You'll find me there, and my publications and so on. If you go on the OU YouTube channel, there's some videos that some we've recorded together and some I've done on my own about veganism, and a podcast up there as well. And there's also a free course you can take for anyone who's interested on Open Learn, which is the Open University's free online learning platform about harm and non-human animals, which I wrote recently. So if people search for that, they can find it. And as I said, that's completely free. You can do that in your own time and extend your interests.
Brilliant. Thank you again so much for your time today. I really, really do appreciate it. And I wish you all the best for the future as well.
You too. Thanks
very much.
Thank you.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.